Christians, by and large, know the teachings of Jesus Christ, but they rarely understand them. This might sound strange to you, but let me prove it to you that this is indeed the case. Are you interested? If you are, most welcome. Take the most obvious case of Jesus' teaching, which has its origin in the Old Testament, that one should love one's neighbor. The two cardinal commandments, commandments that are considered to be absolutely necessary, absolutely imperative, unavoidable, uncompromising, to which no exception is envisaged. First is the duty to love God absolutely. The second is to love one's neighbor equally. Now, the distinction is important. Love God absolutely and love one's neighbor equally. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, Jesus himself is involved in a debate as to the scope of the second commandment, that is the commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself. And the episode, of course, is familiar. An expert in Jewish law, in order to embarrass Jesus, stands up in the midst of the crowd and asks him a question: what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And then, of course, Jesus says, what is written in your scriptures? The man knows it by heart. He says, he reels off the two commandments. Then Jesus says, you go and practice it. You practice what you know, that's all. And then he raises a question: who is my neighbor? You ask me to love my neighbor, but who is my neighbor? Now, in other words, this man knew the commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself, but he has no neighbor. And what Jesus does through the parable of the Good Samaritan is to challenge and enlarge this man's understanding of neighbor, an understanding that's been completely riddled with obsession with power and domination. And power has the necessary, inescapable tendency to create stratifications. Stratifications means hierarchy. Someone is high, someone is low. And the person who is deemed high then invents all sorts of means by which to enlarge and consolidate his superiority. And out of this mentality, the worst form that arises is the mentality of untouchability. And that was what prevailed between Jews and Samaritans. All of that we are familiar with. Now, reduced to its essential, what this whole situation means is that thousands of years of history in the progress of humankind is involved in this teaching. And that's precisely the context in which this teaching needs to be understood. Let me try and make it as simple and short as I can. Humankind, at the beginning of its journey through history, knew only one principle. That was the principle of force. So whoever had the greater force prevailed, and it was widely accepted that the person who had the greater force prevailed over the other legitimately. It was right and proper for him to dominate the other. Go back to the early phase of humankind, when man lived as a nomad. He led a nomadic existence. He was a hunter. A hunter does not have to have any moral scruples about hunting an animal, because he is either stronger than the animal or he is more cunning. Either way it constitutes a superiority. And wherever the superiority of physical force is posited, is legitimized, the moral sentiment, the moral law is suppressed. This is something that we need to understand very clearly. All of human history is an interplay, is a tussle, a tension between the moral law and the law of force, the law of morality and the law of force. In the law of force, the dictum is might is right. In the moral law, the dictum is love your neighbor as yourself. Now, what this teaching therefore means is that your neighbor doesn't have to be stronger than you, richer than you, holier than you, or even holier like you. It's enough that he is a fellow human being. And you have to love and accept that person, whoever happens to be near you. Neighbor simply means literally near dweller. Suppose I live in a place, I'm the only Christian living there, and I'm surrounded by Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, etc. They're all my neighbors. The terrible mistake that the Jews committed was that they could accept only Jews as their neighbors. And Jesus taught the parable of the Good Samaritan in order to enlarge the scope of the concept of the neighbor to include everybody, irrespective of and unmindful of all man-made labels. So through that parable, Jesus was teaching the Jews that Samaritans are their neighbors and therefore they are entitled to be loved. It was a revolutionary teaching, but the revolutionary nature of Jesus' teaching through the parable of the Good Samaritan is not understood by Christians today. And globally, the parable of the Good Samaritan is valued for having contributed an idiom to the English language. So today, if you come across someone who practices charity, you call him a Good Samaritan. That was not at all the idea of Good Samaritan that Jesus taught. Jesus taught the parable of the Good Samaritan as a revolutionary concept in order to challenge and change the Jewish parochial and subhuman idea of neighbor. A Jew could accept only a fellow Jew as his or her neighbor. Jesus rejects this idea of parochialism and teaches people to accept every form of life, no matter in which context, in which form, in which color, in which language it's found, as one's neighbor. But even today, Christians have not understood or accepted this principle. That's why we have even bishops trying to sow seeds of discord between Christians and Muslims in India, because we have not developed the large-heartedness and the spiritual understanding that would enable us to accept someone different to us as our neighbor, whom we are to love as we love ourselves. Okay, now let's stick to a historical background. The nomad, the savage hunter, knew only one principle: might is right, the law of force. And even though through millennia of evolution or progress, civilizational progress, we have emerged from the nomadic state, and we now live in cities, metropolises, etc., surrounded by the amenities of modern culture, and we consider ourselves to be highly cultured or civilized, morally very developed. The fact of the matter is that deep down, the old hunter survives within us. There's so many variations. For example, today, if somebody is hounded by the media, a majority of the people in any given society will be keenly interested in participating in it, because it's the reenactment of the old game of hunting animals. Now we don't have animals in our midst, or by law animals are protected. human beings are not as protected. Therefore, it's possible to hunt fellow human beings. Now, take the most recent heartbreaking example in Kerala. A deputy collector, an ADM by name Naveen Babu, was being transferred from one part of Kerala to another. A farewell meeting was organized for him. It was presided over by the collector, whose assistant this person who is being given the center of was. And there is a lady who happens to be the president of the local panchayat. She seems to have a very special equation with the collector. So she comes and insults the man to the point of driving him to despair and suicide. Now she could do that because she had greater power. She had greater power not because she held a position superior to that of Naveen Babu, but because she had an equation with the collector who was far superior to the man who was publicly insulted and driven to suicide. So ultimately, it is the same old principle of hunting hunting for a game. And when that is done, you should have watched the sense of power that the lady exuded as he was insulting this man in such obnoxious terms, unbearable terms. And even the collector was seen to be enjoying it. And she made it a point to have this ritual of insulting a fellow human being filmed, videographed, and then broadcast statewide. It was given to the media, it was carried home to people all over the state. Because without that publicity, this delight in hunting and hounding a fellow human being will not be perfect. So this is the most recent illustration I can think of. Now think of the Ukraine-Russia war. What is happening there? It is the reenactment of the same thing. The law of power. Putin can easily walk into Ukraine, as he did in 2014, to Crimea, which was part of Ukraine. Though you might argue that Crimea was gifted to Ukraine by Russia at a certain stage. Putin can feel legitimate in his intention to attack Ukraine, not because he has a superior moral claim or an established cultural claim. He feels legitimized in doing whatever he is doing only for one reason. He has far greater power insofar as he presides over unthinkable, unimaginable nuclear weapon arsenal. And therefore, notice this, the logic that works in this whole scenario is completely wonky. Putin is totally convinced that Ukraine has absolutely no right to attack any part of Russia, whereas he has every right to attack any part of Ukraine. Now, this kind of blatantly unequal understanding of relationship between two neighboring countries is possible not according to the moral law. According to the moral law, it is repugnant. But moral law has absolutely no place. The moment war begins, moral law is abolished. That's why we say anything is legitimate in love and warfare. So any outbreak of violence, any decision to have recourse to violence means that ipso facto, by that very fact, the moral law, all moral considerations are renounced. So any religious leader who tries to foment trouble between two religious communities is fundamentally an immoral person, but unfortunately the community concerned does not have the spiritual understanding to recognize it as such. In fact, people would go to the other extreme of saying that this bishop is actually trying to create poison between two communities because he's completely and purely, piously committed to the welfare of the community. But what happens to the teachings of Jesus Christ? What was the mission of Jesus Christ? One aspect, an important aspect of the mission of Jesus Christ was to liberate people from their subjection to the law of force and their re education according to the law of morality, which is a law of love. Now, for example, when Jesus was alive and pursuing his mission, Palestine was under Roman domination. How did Rome dominate the Jews? Not because Romans were spiritually, intellectually superior, but because they had greater power, greater might. Might is right. And Jesus knew that wherever that principle prevailed, the outcome will always be slavery. And Jesus found the same principle in religion, in how religion was organized. In the case of the organization of Judaism, it was not a question of some foreign people coming and dominating. It's a section, a tiny section within the same religious community, dominating the rest of the community, and their superiority over the rest of the community was not spiritual superiority, moral superiority. It was the superiority of power, the power of the establishment, the religious establishment. And Jesus knew that every establishment, religious, political, what have you, that depends on this kind of power will become immoral. And therefore, hypocrisy is inevitable. And this is the logic to Jesus attaching hypocrisy to the priestly class as an inevitable, inescapable condition. Do you belong to the priestly class? Because then rest assured you're a hypocrite. Why? Because the priestly class constitutes the dominant group. The dominant group is not the majority, it is a tiny minority. But the tiny minority will dominate, control, oppress, and exploit the majority. They will, and in order to create them, manipulate and control them, they'll create a situation of inequality. One section is superior and the other section is inferior. And the priestly class is inherently superior to the laity. And within the priestly class, bishops are far superior to priests. On this hierarchy means it is nothing but a mechanism of power, force. So all it knows is the principle of force. And therefore it will create its own set of laws. The purpose of law is to control, never to empower. So once you have this kind of hierarchical organization of a religious establishment, the only outcome and the inevitable outcome is slavery for the rest. So the believers are slaves, which they don't understand because from birth onwards they are accustomed to this arrangement alone. They have not been exposed to anything different. So they have come to accept that this is the norm. But Jesus could well understand that this is not the norm and it should not be the norm. And therefore he said, I've come to set the captives free. Who are the captives? The religious slaves. Jesus' principle is very clear, crystal clear. Anyone who happens to be trapped within this system, which is hierarchical, within which a tiny handful of people dominate the rest brutally, mainly employing the psychological force of fear and the worldly force of law, religious laws. The Catholic Church is extremely good at it. They have canon law, which actually was a precursor for the evolution of secular law in Europe. That is the efficiency with which the Catholic domination, clergy domination of the laity was maintained, against which, of course, Martin Luther rebelled, with what consequences we know. Even the Reformed churches imitated the Catholic Church as far as this hierarchical structure is concerned, because for the priestly class, the preservation and the aggravation of the hierarchical structure is the very purpose for which they live. All their perks, all their advantages, privileges, and the inflated, exaggerated respect that they command, which they don't merit at all, everything depends on this unequal, hierarchical, and therefore inherently unethical, immoral system or structure that they create. So Jesus knew that the outcome of this kind of arrangement is slavery, and therefore it was a stated mission goal for Jesus to liberate people from this religious slavery. And Christians are taught, as is to be expected, that this means only political slavery. Whereas the fact is that Jesus said nothing about political slavery. All the time, he was mindful of the religious slavery of human beings, because ultimately, religious slavery does more harm than political slavery. So let's go back in history. As I said, from the beginning of human consciousness, the principle that dominated the human scenario was the force of physical, the law of physical force. The earliest example, of course, is a hunter. But then as time went on, you find the same principle being changed but retained, changed and retained. For example, in relation to nature, it became a stated and proud goal to conquer nature. Conquer nature. Whereas the relationship between human beings and nature that God envisaged, as stated in the second chapter of the book of Genesis, verse 15, is that man should take care of the world. Man is a caretaker. Now he has reinvented himself as the conqueror. What is the force operative here? Power, strength. That's what I say. It is the law of power, the law of force. The correct word to use there is force. The law of force that characterizes human nature. And at least at this 11th hour, Christians must realize, and as all people must realize, that all of spirituality is one continuous, arduous, most difficult task of liberating people from their addiction to this law of force, and to de-school them vis-a-vis the law of force, and to re-educate them, re-school them in relation to the law of morality. So from the perspective of the law of force, your neighbor is your enemy. That is why in a system dominated by force, everyone will see everyone else as an enemy, a threat. Now, for example, take the case of the problem in Palestine. The Jews and the Palestinians, I've done 2 videos on this already, can only see each other as mortal enemies, and therefore one must eliminate the other. Because it's very difficult to dominate the other effectively and sufficiently for any length of time. And if you can't dominate the other, the only viable solution is to eliminate the other. And that is precisely the thinking on both sides. Unfortunately, there is an asymmetry, there is an inequality of power, and therefore Israel dominates. If the Palestinians on this side had greater power than the Jews, the boot would have been on this leg, that's all. So when I look at the scenario, I find it very difficult to be loyal to any particular group. I find both of them as victims of this old hunter mentality, out of which we are supposed to evolve and enter into this new spiritual domain of treating each other as neighbors and learning the art of living together harmoniously, which unfortunately is considered a weakness. Hamas attacked the Jews on the 7th of October last year because that's the only way it can continue to legitimize its own existence. It's an existential imperative for them. Likewise, for Netanyahu, it's an existential imperative for him to pulverize the Palestinians and to prove that he can provide security to the Jews. Both are identical in their blind and absolute faith in the efficacy of force. Force, 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 nothing but force. And let me say this to you, as long as this remains the outlook, no one will be able to live together harmoniously with anyone else. Everyone will have to eliminate everyone else in the name of peaceful coexistence. And unfortunately, people don't understand the tragic irony of all this. Or now take another manifestation. Slaves. Think of the high point of world civilization, Athens, of Aristotle's times, Plato's times, and before that Socrates' times, etc. Athens was full of slaves. There were more slaves in Athens than citizens. Even this most enlightened Athenians, the city of Plato and Aristotle, felt absolutely nothing wrong about slavery. Because the pattern in slavery is, again, the law of force. It may be economic force, it may be military force. As I said in one of my earlier videos, it was very customary in ancient days to capture people from the vanquished side in a war and make them slaves. And those who are thus rendered slaves were duty bound by law, to serve their masters faithfully, without any rebellion, and the master had the legal right to kill his slaves, and they had no legal remedy for it. And it is a manifestation of the same principle. Now look at Rome around the same time. Historians tell us that for every Roman nobleman, there were at least 30 slaves. And the Roman nobility had the same degree of absolute power over the slaves as the Athenian had. Much later come over to the United States of America, the Bible Belt, slave trade. And the master of the slave had absolute right over the slave. There was no legal redress to a slave if he was brutalized, even killed by the master. Then the familiar arrangement of male domination. Why should men dominate women? Only for one reason, the law of force. Now, Jesus has all of this historical background in underlining the teaching that we should love our neighbors as ourselves. But what is important for us to realize is that we can never love our neighbors like ourselves so long as we remain rooted in the old principle and the psychology that goes with it, namely the principle of the law of force. The idea that we should love each other equally, the idea that I should do to you what I desire that you should do to me, or I should treat you as I would like to be treated, is not an idea acceptable within this framework of the law of force. The law of force says, I'm more powerful than you, you have no right, and I'll therefore do with you as I please. The law of morality, the law of love, the law of divine understanding of human nature, the scope of being human, or the quintessentially human outlook, maintains you and I, we are the same, tattvamasi, that thou art. I am incomplete without you. And all the superficial differences between you and me, they don't count. Essentially, we are one. That's the moral law. Unless and until we come out of the law of force and are re-educated in the law of morality, the law of love, we cannot practice this principle. Therefore, Christians know this teaching, love your neighbor as yourself, but they do not know a thing about what it means. Therefore, all through the history of Christianity, you see bloodshed, war, violence, tension, killing, including religious killing, Spanish Inquisition, Roman Inquisition. Even today, if you displease the church authorities, you can't be physically killed, but you will be religiously killed. You will be cast out. If you can ever convince a bishop or a priest, I challenge you, if you can really convince a bishop or a priest to love one's neighbors, leave alone enemies, to love one's enemies like oneself and practice it, hats off to you. I have not seen this happen anywhere. In fact, bishops revel in the thought that they are unequal. Bishops revel in the thought that others are far, far below them, therefore they can impose their will whimsically, brutally, insensitively over the rest of the community. And the laity on their part are very grateful when they are brutalized in this manner, when they are treated like slaves. They take pride in it. I have been a personal witness to so many people in very commendable circumstances of life, wealthy, educated, well employed, behaving like abject slaves before their thirumenis and taking pride in it. During my travels in the United States, I've come across many Christians who have told me that, when Thirumenis come here, they come and stay in our house. So whenever Thirumeni comes, I buy a new car so Thirumeni can travel. The Thirumeni would be the first person to travel by the new car. So if next year also Thirumeni comes, I'll buy a new car. Because Thirumeni must be made to travel only by a new car. 1-year-old car is bad for Thirumeni. And this is what I call slavery. This slavery is deeply entrenched. I remember having a meal with an Orthodox bishop. I happened to be a resource person for a meeting. This was in Delhi. And the lunch that day was organized in the house of a very ardent Syrian Orthodox person. What I saw there really shocked me. The bishop is sitting across me at the table, and on either side of the bishop, 2 men are standing with tender coconut, cut open with the straw inserted. So there were people sitting with me, not standing. Srimeni is alone on the side. I am sitting here. There are other people sitting and eating with me. So I turned to one of them. I said, "Why are 2 people standing? What did one do?" He said, "No. When we prepare the table for Thirumeni, we make sure that on both sides 2 people stand with the coconut, so that we do not know which way Thirumeni will turn. Suppose the bishop turns this way, then he should be able to drink from this coconut. Suppose it pleases His Highness to turn this way, then he should be able to drink from this coconut." And the sense of pride with which this is being explained. You will see that every imaginable means for driving home the difference between and the superiority of the priestly class in relation to the laity will be resorted to. As for example, the issue on which I incurred the wrath of the Marthoma Church, I simply raised the question as to why it is that when bishops are buried, they are made to sit in a chair and then buried, whereas ordinary people are allowed the luxury of lying down for their burial. I was since then, now last 6 years, I have been painted as the most terrible enemy of the Marthoma Church. Now, the reason, of course, is simple. This is one more way by which the superiority of the bishop as compared to the laity is driven home. And every Marthomite is upset with me because they believe that if this inequality is questioned, then their Marthoma church will collapse. That's how deep-rooted the teaching is. And from the perspective of Jesus Christ, I have absolutely no right and no uncertainty in saying this. This is immoral, absolutely immoral. This glorification of inequality, which always works to the degradation of the laity, is immoral, downright immoral. Therefore, it's high time that Christians realize that when Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself, is a revolutionary teaching, and what it involves fundamentally is the renunciation of the law of force, which applies to us and influences our outlook and behavior in so many ways, which we consider to be highly pious and our duty to practice. Renouncing all of that and coming to this vision of life that Jesus propagated, the vision of love, and wherever love operates, there is equality. Love is totally inimical to hierarchy. That is why when you create hierarchy, you're actually legitimizing and sanctifying lovelessness. You're casting out love. And if love is cast out, Jesus will have no place there, because Jesus is the incarnation of God's love for the world. As John says in his Gospel, chapter 3, verse 16, God so loved the world that he gave his Son, that whoso believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. So if you cast out love and make yourself a slave of this system of hierarchy, which is sustained by the law of force, how was Jesus killed? Money power. Judas was bribed with 30 pieces of silver. That's called money power. That was not enough. The priestly class used manpower. When Pontius Pilate was reluctant to condemn Jesus to death, what did the high priest and his coterie do? They incited the people. They began to bay for the blood of Jesus. Crucify him, let his blood come upon us and our children and their children. Power. The power of the masses, right? Money power, the power of the masses, and the power of the Roman Empire. Politics, the power of politics. That is how the priestly class operates. Even today, the priestly class operates only in this manner. That is why it's considered the most sacred duty of Christians to donate more and more money. And Christians have absolutely no way to understand the diabolic nature of this scheme. Therefore, they feel very fulfilled when they give more money to the church. They are actually making the church more and more diabolical, savage. It is a hunter mentality. Therefore, if you happen to incur the displeasure of the man sitting there in the chair, throne, then you had it. But who created this monster? You yourself, your mammon. And Jesus is including all of these historical insights in his teaching in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Please understand that parable is not as simple as you think it is. No one has fully understood the scope, the spiritual scope of that parable. Rather, its teeth have been plucked and some kind of a pious, sentimental interpretation is imposed on it. And therefore, the parable of the Good Samaritan has no impact whatsoever on us. So it has become a story, a nice story for people to preach about, and no one really takes it seriously. That's why I'm saying Christians know the teachings of Jesus Christ, but they never understand it. They never want to understand it. And if someone tries to provide some means by which the real meanings can be understood, he will be stigmatized as an enemy of Christianity. Again, the 100 principle. 100 principle. The Christian savage. The Christian savage. Please open your eyes and see the reality. It was a Christian savage who crucified, it was a Jewish savage who crucified Jesus Christ. But is a Christian savage who continues the crucifixion. And all pious Christians are providing nails and hammer to continue this crucifixion so long as they subscribe to the law of force, which also includes the law of money. That's why Jesus said you cannot serve God and mammon, because the God of mammon is the God of force, and will result in slavery, oppression, conflict, and the destruction of the other. And with that, the complete destruction of one's inner life and one's spiritual life. Love your neighbor as yourself. May God grant to us the strength and the large-heartedness, the aristocracy of the Spirit, to love others as we love ourselves.